On the afternoon of January 18th, 52 BC, the most powerful building on Earth was set on fire by its own citizens. A mob shattered the bronze doors of the Roman Senate House, carried a bleeding corpse inside, and piled the wooden benches of the senators into a makeshift funeral pyre. Within hours, the ancient center of global power had burned entirely to the ground. It sounds impossible. This was the peak of the Roman Republic, an empire whose highly disciplined legions enforced order across the known world. Yet at the very center of that empire lay a terrifying paradox, a metropolis of nearly 1 million people with absolutely no public police force. If you lived in those cramped, winding streets, the only law that protected your family was whoever had the most men with clubs. What those flames in the Senate House actually signaled was the climax of a forgotten shadow war, the story of how the greatest republic in history was hijacked not by a foreign army, but by two rival street gangs. To understand how Rome lost control of itself, you have to look past the marble monuments and into the slums. By the late 1st century BC, Rome was swelling with hundreds of thousands of urban poor, crowded into towering apartment blocks prone to collapse and fire. To survive in this brutal environment, citizens organized themselves into collegia, neighborhood associations and trade guilds for bakers, carpenters, and merchants. For generations, they were nothing more than harmless social clubs that organized religious festivals and paid for each other's funerals. But the Roman government made a critical oversight. Because the Republic deeply feared tyranny and the rise of a king, it refused to keep an armed guard inside the city walls. The senators relied entirely on the majesty of their authority and the weight of tradition to keep the peace. And in 58 BC, an ambitious, highly dangerous aristocrat named Publius Clodius Pulcher realized the fatal flaw in that ancient design. Authority without physical force is nothing but an illusion. Clodius did not want to conquer a foreign country, he wanted to conquer Rome itself. So, as a tribune of the plebs, he passed a law completely legalizing the collegia, and then he quietly weaponized them. He transformed these innocent neighborhood guilds into a highly organized paramilitary syndicate. He divided the slums into distinct districts, appointed street captains, and handed out weapons. Overnight, Clodius built the police force Rome never had, except it answered only to him. The historical records left behind by the enemies reveal a machine of terrifying efficiency. This was not a disorganized, angry mob throwing stones in a plaza. It was a political cartel on a strict payroll. When a vote in the forum was not going his way, Clodius would simply signal his captains, and thousands of armed gang members would seal off the exits. They would physically prevent citizens from casting their ballots, turning the democratic process into a hostage situation. The ultimate proof of the terrifying power came when he turned his machine against the most famous speaker and statesman in Rome, Marcus Tullius Cicero. Clodius mobilized his gangs to pass a law effectively banishing Cicero from the city. But the gang did not stop at political exile. They marched on luxurious home of Cicero on the Palatine Hill, looted his possessions, burned the mansion to the ground, and mockingly built a temple to liberty over the smoldering ruins. Even the highest elites were completely defenseless against the mob. The Republic's legal system simply collapsed under the pressure of street-level intimidation. Judges were terrorized into silence. Rival politicians were chased from the public squares under a hail of broken pavement stones and roof tiles. At one point, the gang's grip on the city was so absolute that Pompey the Great, the most famous and successful general in the Roman world, a man who had conquered entire nations in the East, was forced to barricade himself inside his own house for months, terrified of the thugs waiting at his front door. The Roman Senate was paralyzed. They were the masters of the Mediterranean, commanding vast resources and territories, but they could not even walk safely down their own streets without an armed escort. Desperate, humiliated, and unwilling to call in a formal army that might turn on them, they decided that the only way to break a monster was to build one of their own. They threw their quiet, unofficial support behind another ruthless politician, a man named Titus Annius Milo. But Milo did not bother recruiting bakers and carpenters from the slums. He used his vast personal wealth to purchase literal gladiators, highly trained, heavily armed professional killers, and turned them loose in the streets. The Republic had not restored order, it had just funded a proxy war in its own capital. What followed was an escalation that shattered the daily life of the ancient city. Rome quickly descended into open urban warfare. The overwhelming numbers clashed against the lethal, disciplined violence of Milo's gladiators. The ancient sources describe pitched battles erupting in the shadows of the sacred temples, with the gutters of the Forum literally running red with blood. The reality of daily life in the capital shifted into something unrecognizable. Politicians began wearing military armor hidden beneath their civilian togas just to walk to work. When the Senate finally attempted to vote on bringing Cicero back from exile, the gangs attacked the assembly with drawn swords. In the ensuing slaughter, own brother of Cicero was left for dead beneath a pile of corpses, and the ancient historians recorded that the nearby Tiber River was filled with bodies, while the city's sewers choked with blood. The violence became so normalized that the basic functions of government ground to a complete halt. Consular elections had to be postponed for months on end because the voting booths at the campus martius were essentially active war zones. The Roman citizens, who prided themselves on their liberty and their strict adherence to the rule of law, were suddenly prisoners in their own capital, forced to navigate around armed barricades just to buy daily bread. The tension finally snapped on a cold winter afternoon in 52 BC on the Appian Way just outside the city walls. Clodius and Milo were both traveling along the ancient highway with their respective armed retinues when they accidentally crossed paths near a small shrine. What started as a petty exchange of insults between the trailing guards at the back of the pack instantly detonated into a brutal skirmish. In the chaotic frenzy of the fight, a javelin sailed through the air and struck Clodius in the shoulder. Bleeding heavily, he was carried into a nearby roadside inn to recover. But Milo, sitting outside, realized that leaving his greatest rival alive after such an attack would guarantee his own political and physical destruction. On Milo's orders, his gladiators stormed the inn, dragged Clodius back out into the dirt of the ancient highway, and hacked him to death. When the news reached Rome, the city exploded. The urban poor, who genuinely loved Clodius for championing their rights and giving them free grain, carried his bleeding, battered body back into the center of the capital. And this is where the story loops back to that impossible image in the cold open, the moment the grieving, furious mob carried him directly into the Curia, the Senate house. They did not just burn a building down. By turning the seats of the senators into a funeral pyre, the crowd was sending a deliberate, unmistakable message. The Republic had failed them. The Senate's authority was completely hollow, incapable of protecting its citizens or managing its own city. The fire that consumed the Curia eventually spread to the surrounding buildings, a literal, physical manifestation of how the gang warfare had consumed the entire Roman system. This forgotten chapter of street violence reveals a profound truth about how democracies actually die. We are often taught that the Roman Republic fell because ambitious generals grew too powerful, and mighty armies marched on the capital to install emperors. But the evidence suggests something much quieter and much darker. The Republic did not break on the battlefield. It rotted from the inside out, hollowed out by political violence that made a mockery of the law. When Julius Caesar finally crossed the Rubicon 3 years later with his legions, claiming he was coming to restore order to a broken state, the people of Rome did not fight back. After years of gangs, blockades, and burning buildings, the citizens were exhausted. They were no longer choosing between a dictator and a free republic. They were choosing between a dictator and the daily terror of the streets. And in the end, they willingly traded their liberty for the promise of a quiet night. Thank you for watching. If this changed how you see the ancient world, please subscribe and join us next time as we uncover another hidden piece of the human story.